So appreciate you all being interested in learning more and here to ask your questions tonight about MBTA communities. I'll just introduce who we have here tonight. So my name is Ian Burns. I work with the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. I oversee our community and economic development team at the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. We are a public agency that supports the 15 cities and towns in the Merrimack Valley with their long-term planning in a wide array of areas, one of those areas being housing. And so we are assisting the town of Newbury as well as about 8 or 9 other communities locally with their compliance with MBTA communities. Although we are a public agency, we did not write the law or the regulations. Our job is to help the town find a path for compliance and ultimately allow town meeting voters to decide on if you will adopt this local bylaw for compliance with MBTA communities. I'm joined by Gerard Whitten, our executive director, also Newbury resident, so he's wearing a couple hats tonight. You guys want to introduce yourself from the town?
Sure. I'm Martha Taylor, planning director, and this is Kristen Grubbs, our assistant planner. And thank you so much for coming tonight. A couple things. We do have a sign-in sheet going around, so if anybody who hasn't signed it yet could do that, that would be wonderful. We've got some refreshments here, so please help yourselves. And we also have some fact sheets over on the chair there, along with some maps showing our sub-districts for the overlay district, which Ian will explain.
Great. So we have a lot of content for you all tonight. If some of you have either been to any past meetings about this, listened to planning board meetings, or read about it, some of it might be repetitive. We just want to make sure everybody's on the same page with what we're covering, and we all have the same level of base knowledge before we dive in a bit to what we're talking about in Newbury. So throughout the presentation, there's going to be a couple places where we pause, where you can feel free to ask some questions and let us know kind of what's on your mind if you're confused about something. Some of the pieces are really technical, so we want to take our time to make sure everybody understands what exactly the law is and what the proposal is right here in Newbury. So for the agenda, we'll start off talking about a little bit of background of what exactly multifamily housing is and what is the legislation and the regulations. How does Newbury fit into this new law and what are the requirements in Newbury? We'll then dive into, after taking some questions about those regulations, we'll dive into the proposal in Newbury right now. And that is the proposal that folks will be voting on at town meeting next week. We'll look at the potential districts, talk about the zoning parameters that are in the proposed bylaw amendment, and then allow folks to ask some questions about the bylaw itself. As a part of that discussion of the bylaw, we're going to dive in a little bit to what exactly is in it in addition to those dimensional parameters, so things like height restrictions and setbacks from the road. There are also a couple other components that we think are key to talk about that are involved in any future development if a development were to happen. So with that, we're going to dive right into MBTA communities in the background. So the history of the legislation here, it was passed by the legislature in 2021. And so many of you may have heard about this before. It's actually started back in 2021. It did have broad bipartisan support at the time when it passed the legislature, signed by Governor Baker, and has since been now being enforced by the Healy administration. It applies to all cities and towns that have an MBTA commuter rail stop or are adjacent to a town with an MBTA commuter rail stop. So Newburyport, of course, is right to your northern border. They have a commuter rail stop. Raleigh to your south has one. So it does apply to Newbury here. The goal of the legislation, a lot of it was looked at as, what is the housing shortage in the state right now and how can we encourage more housing production? Although the law does not require production, it does require a change in zoning. And what has been seen statewide historically is that zoning essentially doesn't allow for a lot of housing production right now. So that was, from the legislature's perspective, their motivation in passing this law. However, the law itself does not require production of housing. This requires us to change zoning regulations to allow multifamily housing by right. And it is, like I said, creation of a zoning district, not a production mandate. So it is totally valid if we create a zoning district and no construction actually happens after the fact. It may be that some parcels that are zoned over get turned into multifamily housing, but it's not a requirement that those properties where we create the zoning district actually become housing. So what does that all actually mean? So we have to zone for multifamily housing. The zoning that we have to create has to comply with a couple of things. Number one, the multifamily housing has to be permitted as of right. When we say the term as of right, what we mean is that there is not a special permit process that is attached to a proposal. So if a property owner owns land and wants to turn it into multifamily housing, they go to the planning board and get the planning board's approval based off of that they fit everything in the bylaw itself. They don't need to go through a discretionary review process where they would have to get special permission from the planning board to do it. Essentially, they have to show we're following the bylaw, so we can build this here, and they get their building permits accordingly. By right development, however, does have to adhere to all state, federal, and local environmental laws. So any environmental protections that are in place, a by right development has to adhere to. And it also has to adhere to a couple other things that we'll talk about a little bit later on, like design standards of what we want to see out of the construction of a housing development, and certain affordability components as well. There's no age restrictions that are allowed on this. You could incentivize it, but you cannot say it is only for seniors, for example, and you cannot restrict the unit size. So you can't say only 1-bedrooms are allowed to be built in this zoning district. You have to allow the developer to build any size bedroom that they want. The minimum gross density is 15 units per acre, and so what that means is that we have to show that it is potentially feasible for a developer to come in and build 15 units per acre. However, we know there are other limitations in effect that might prevent them from doing that. One of the things we talk about when we talk about 15 units per acre is that we have to prove that that could happen under ideal ground conditions and under ideal infrastructure conditions. So in the case of Newbury, we know, for example, that you don't have public sewer and water everywhere in town. You don't have public sewer everywhere. If a developer comes in and they can't build at 15 units per acre because they have to put in a septic system, that's totally fine. They might be restricted, and that's okay. What we have to show with that 15 units per acre is that it is under perfect conditions. If everything was ready for a developer, they could potentially build it. So that's where some of the trick and the technicality of this comes in, because it may be that we zone for it, and then a developer comes in and says, oh, I really can't do it because that half of the parcel or the lot is a little wet, or there's bad soil or something. That's out of our control. We just have to show if they had a perfect pad to come in and they had their infrastructure hookups ready to go, could they build that? And then in communities that have a commuter rail station, which is not Newbury, you have to show that you're within a half mile of that station in some areas of town.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
What does that mean, that last line? It says it doesn't apply to Newbury because we're an adjacent small town.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
Great question. Next slide here about the difference between the different community categories. I'm so glad you're on top of it. So there are 3 different categories that the state has broken down as a part of the regulations. And each community has to adhere to a different set of regulations depending on the category that they're in. And so we have 3 communities here in the Merrimack Valley region. The darkest teal color here is a commuter rail community, so those are cities and towns with a commuter rail stop. The darker yellow kind of mustard color is an adjacent community, so that's a community next to a community with a commuter rail stop. And then there's another classification that Newbury is under called an adjacent small town. And that has the same adjacency to a commuter rail stop as an adjacent community. However, the state has recognized that smaller towns have more restrictions on their ability to build more units. And so the requirements are lesser in adjacent small towns than it is in just a regular adjacent community. And so Newbury is that lighter beige color here, and you can see other communities nearby in the same category: West Newbury, Merrimack, Groveland, and Boxford, to name a few.
Does that mean that that half a mile within a rail station doesn't apply to Newbury?
Correct.
Or it does?
It does not apply to Newbury because the actual station itself is in Newburyport, so the state drew the line there and said you're not a town with a commuter rail station, therefore you don't have to put it within a half mile of your station. So when, as an adjacent small town, you have to zone for what they say is a capacity equal to 5% of your existing housing stock. In Newbury, that means 154 units. Now again, going back to that conversation about density, what we have to do is essentially show that under perfect conditions, could we build 154 units if everything happened? A developer bought the land, owned the land, and then went through the process necessary. Is it feasible for you to build that many units? We have to show that to the state in order for the zoning to be allowed. So one of the things we might be wondering is, what happens after a zoning amendment is adopted? And so we're going through this entire timeline process, and once it actually gets to town meeting, there's a couple things that still need to happen, and it's the reason why we're voting on it this year and maybe not next year or at a different time. And so even if town meeting votes in favor, let's imagine that the zoning amendment passes town meeting this year, or next week I should say, the state still has to review that bylaw and review Newbury zoning to approve it. That process could take several months for them to go through. After they go through that, the Attorney General also has to review the zoning bylaw to approve it and say that it is legal language and it is legal zoning. And so even though town meeting may vote in May in favor, may vote next week, I should say, that's what May is. It may vote next week in favor, there's still a process that unfolds. So Newbury, as we'll talk about in a minute, is a little bit ahead of its timeline. The deadline is 2025, December 25 next year, but the town is trying to pass something now to see if it is approved, and then if it is approved, do they meet all the qualifications? For some communities that their deadline is this year, they're a bit crunched for time because they're gonna pass something now, and then the state's gonna take its time and they may come back to the town in October and say, oop, you have this issue, and now the town only has a couple months to figure it out. Newbury has extra time, so it's good that they're kind of taking a look at it now. If it were to pass, there's still a process that needs to unfold. Kind of the big question that looms after we think about all this is, why do we actually need to comply with this legislation, and what happens if we don't? And so there's a couple things to keep in mind with it. Number one, that if we don't comply with the legislation, you do lose access to several state grant programs. There's a group of them, that a couple of them listed up here, but then there's about a dozen that you'll be less competitive for as well when applying for. We've looked at some of the numbers, and Newbury's received several $100,000 worth of grants from some of these programs over the past few years. And so the town wants to keep in mind that fiscal impact of not accessing grant programs. Those are for things like small bridge repair, culvert repairs for stormwater runoff, and a few other areas. The other thing too to keep in mind is, really at the end of the day, this is a state law. And the Attorney General has made clear that they intend to enforce the law. And so some of you may have heard in the news about the town of Milton, which decided not to implement this law. They're currently being sued by the state right now for that, and that's making its way through the court system. And so certainly, in addition to access to grant funds, the town would need to consider potential legal fees if it wants to take the state to court over this, because the state is enforcing their laws. I mean, that's kind of the doom and gloom side of thing of what happens if we don't comply, but what happens if we do? And so some of the perspectives that, as we were talking with the town, with the planning board, and other members of the community about what exactly is it that can happen if we comply. Is there any opportunity here for the town of Newbury? So a couple things we've been considering along the way. Number one, are there areas of town that we want to signal may be better for development than others? If a developer's coming in, there's a couple tools they could use to build development wherever they want, but we actually want to show them where it would be preferred, and then that implies areas that we don't want to have development. So by picking specific areas of town, signaling to developers, this is better for development, and then signaling the other areas we did not select, not very good for development, we don't want to see development there. As a part of the bylaw, if we do comply, we can also set design standards. And so we can say, if you're constructing under this zoning, we want to see a pitched roof, make sure there's no flat roofs in your building. We want to see structures that have a varying facade on them where it's not just one big box. Many of you might be familiar with Newburyport Crossing next to the commuter rail station, those new apartment buildings that went up there recently. That's not what we want to see in Newbury, and we know we don't want to see that. So as a part of this bylaw process, we can stipulate this is the kind of building that we want you to build if you come in and propose something. Some of you may have heard of 40B, which is a state law that allows developers to override local zoning if they're building a certain amount of affordable housing. That's kind of the state law that allows developers to come in and build multifamily housing really in almost anywhere across a town. With a 40B development, the town doesn't have control over what is happening where. However, if we're zoning for multifamily housing in one place, we can say to a developer, don't build the 40B over there, use our standards over here where we're already allowing it, and it's an easier process for you. 40B is a very complicated process for developers to go through. There's a lot of appeals, a lot of time that goes into it, a lot of money associated with that time. So a developer usually wants to go the easiest route, and that's the route with the by right zoning that we're crafting now. So we're trying to say, here's where we want by right zoning, and here's where we're comfortable with you doing that in order to make sure that they have that pass so that we don't have to have that looming threat of a potential larger development. And then at the end of the day, one of the things we've talked about is really the need for housing choice and housing diversity in town. A lot of us, as we've been going through this process, we've been talking about how Newbury might have a need for additional, maybe smaller housing units for folks that want to downsize, or for young couples that are looking for a new place to live in town. And so trying to create more community choice. In Newbury right now, we see a lack of smaller, like 1 or 2 bedroom unit homes, and that may prevent someone that is maybe an empty nester or in a 4-bedroom home that wants to downsize. There's not a lot of options out there. So one of the other perspectives we have with this is how can we try and encourage housing that allows downsizing options for people that may want to move out of their larger home. If you want to stay in your big home, that's fantastic, and you should be able to do that for as long as you want, but making sure the options are there if people want to downsize. So that was a lot of information I gave just on the background of the law, and that was just about what the regulations are. Before we talk about a little bit more about the conditions in Newbury and the proposal that's at town meeting next week, I want to pause and offer a time for any questions about the regulations and what's required in Newbury. Yeah.
So if zoning changes occur, do the neighbors have anything to say about what goes on next to them?
In a by right development, they would have very limited say in what happens because the zoning has already happened. They received notice of the potential zoning change as a part of the public hearing process over the winter. So when this zoning district was proposed, the neighbors had a say then in terms of the type of zoning there. But if a development comes forward, they have very limited tools to stop a development because the zoning is in place and it is by right.
Do they have an ability to input on how the law is written in terms of developing sizes or footprint or heights or any of those things?
So that was determined as a part of the bylaw development process that's being proposed at town meeting, so that
So
time
the
for
answer
input.
is no, it's already done.
Yeah, they did have time for input over the past year when that language was being crafted.
We've had several public hearings on
Okay.
it as part of the planning board process.
Okay.
And just to follow up a little bit on what Ian was saying, any multifamily proposal that comes in will be required to go through site plan review with the planning board. That will be a public hearing process. And as part of it, the board makes sure that, as Ian said, it meets the requirements of our bylaw, which he'll go through. But there will also be opportunity for public input, during that public hearing process. To help shape it, so it's not a discretionary, the board can't say, no, we're not going to accept it, because as Ian said, it's by right, but there is process.
So the process is after you've already said, okay, you can do it.
That's when the zoning is in place, and if we get a proposal from a developer to do a multifamily development in one of the areas, sub-districts that we've identified.
So no limitations are placed on the development when you write the bylaws?
There are, so we'll talk about that
Okay.
shortly. Yep,
I don't
there are
mean to jump
dimensional
ahead.
standards, certainly. Yeah.
Right.
And we'll dive into that for sure. There are limitations, most certainly. It's very similar, this process, to if someone were to propose a single-family home on an empty 1 acre lot in town right now, that process they would have to go through to build that home is similar to what this process would be for a developer proposing a multifamily housing. You still have to show you're doing everything according to the law, but it is by right. Yeah, question in the back.
Is this homes or condos, or can it be apartment complexes too?
It can be anything with 3 units or more, so it's
But they
multifamily
could be
housing.
rentals.
Yep, it can be rentals, yep. Question, yeah.
Are there any restrictions on cost of these units to live in? Are they meant to be low-income housing or?
Yeah, good teaser for some slides in the future there. So yes, there is an affordability restriction on a certain percentage of the units. We'll talk about it soon. It's more, I would describe as middle income housing than low income housing, but we'll discuss that later on, yeah. Any other questions about the state regulations here? Yeah.
Hi, how many MBTA communities are there in the Commonwealth?
Good trivia. I think 172,
77.
77. Oh, people know better than me. Very good. Go ahead, yeah.
And the second question, last night, we accepted a grant for $200,000 for a culvert on Orchard Street.
Yeah.
I don't know the source of that grant, but would the source of that grant perhaps be one of these that you listed that we would not be eligible for if it were rejected?
Yeah, it's very likely, I would say. Just knowing those programs, those are usually under, I would guess it's something like the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Plan or something similar program or something similar, but we can look at it, and I would say it probably is, but I'd have to look at it to be sure.
Yeah, that project on Orchard Street for the culvert has gotten a few different grants. I think one was federal funding, which isn't necessarily affected by this, but I know they also have received the Municipal Vulnerability Program grant, which is state funding that is in this category.
Okay. And my recollection is that in Milton, upon rejecting this, they were granted, I think, $400,000, which was later reneged on, I guess. That's what it's saying.
Correct.
$140,000
$140,000.
seawall grant that was immediately revoked.
Okay. Okay,
After it was overturned.
thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about the regulations themselves before we talk about the bylaw? Yeah.
Did you say you could do a multifamily combined with a 40B as long as it's in the right location? Did you say that or did I mishear you?
I think it was a little confusing the way I was speaking to it. It wouldn't be combined with a 40B necessarily. What we were showing was the difference between the two there. And so this would be multifamily in its own right. It wouldn't be a 40B development. The point more is that it might provide some insulation from 40B because you're giving a developer probably a better path that they would prefer than going through a 40B process.
Thank you.
A 40B process is what?
So that's when a developer has the right to override local zoning if they're doing a large chunk of affordable housing. That's a state law that's been around for a long time. And so when a developer can do that, they have to go through a lengthy process to prove they're building development in a certain place and that they're following the state law. It's the law that a lot of developers use when zoning prohibits multifamily housing. And it's a lengthy appeals process the developer has to go through.
So it costs them too much money and they
Yep.
don't do it.
Yeah, well, often they do it because in the end, they get to build something, but they would prefer the easier route. And so if we provide an easier route that has more restrictions built in from Newbury's side, that's kind of the process. The 40B has very few restrictions. This,
Okay.
we can put more restrictions on, and it's an easier route for them. So we figure, let's give them, let's put more restrictions on the easier route, so they might go in that direction instead of going the direction where they have less restrictions. Because right now, that's their only option, is the one with.
And the restrictions get written after the zoning has changed?
They're
When
in the
somebody
zoning.
applies?
Nope, so they're written in the zoning, and we'll talk about those
Oh,
restrictions
okay.
shortly. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yep.
There we go.
So
That's-
just one other word on the 40B. 40B can basically override or not comply with any local regulations, so any of our zoning regulations, any of our subdivision rules and regulations. It still needs to adhere to, state regulations. But in the case of the multifamily that we're proposing, we've developed regulations that have to do with setbacks and heights and amount of open space and all of that. So as Ian was saying earlier, it gives us a lot more control over what gets built.
And we're still vulnerable to any 40B.
Well, the
Study.
40B has to do with the amount
Thank
of
you.
affordability in town.
Take it back in a minute.
But I think Ian will get into some of
Yeah,
that as
okay.
well.
I saw questions. Are there any more questions about the regulations here in the law before we dive into it? Yeah.
Is there a requirement to have commercial space within that? Or is that something?
It's not a requirement to have commercial space as part of it.
Right, it's allowed, but it's not a requirement.
Thank you.
Okay.
So we're gonna dive into a little bit about the process that we've gone through and kind of where we've arrived in collaboration with the planning board and other folks around town as we've been working through this proposal. And so the first slide that we wanted to show is, it's a lot of words up here, but it really is just pointing out a lot of the work that we've been doing in public meetings over the past year to try and craft this proposal. And so this meeting tonight is actually the 14th meeting that we've had over the past year that is in a public meeting. Back in December, we had a joint meeting of the select board and planning board that we presented to get their feedback on some ideas for a proposal. We also had focused feedback from the public at 3 meetings over the fall and winter, where we presented some options and talked about MBTA communities to get public feedback on the plan that was being put together. We then were at several public meetings, or planning board meetings. Those were open to the public. Not all of them were public feedback session, but we had open public discussions about the law. And then there were there was a series of 1 public hearing over 3 different planning board meetings where the public was welcome to give feedback. That was that opportunity, especially, I mean, they could have the entire time, but for the neighbors and abutters, they would have gotten notification before those 3 public hearings over the winter that this is a proposal and this is your chance to comment on the process and request any changes or modifications to the proposal. Ultimately, we're here tonight, and then next week at town meeting, residents have the opportunity to vote yes or no on this. The town of Newbury does have until the end of 2025 to comply, but like we said earlier, we're trying to get a proposal out here now so we can be ahead of it if the state has any issues with the proposal that's eventually passed, and we have an opportunity for adjustments if needed. So when we first started digging into this and talking to the planning board, a lot of conversations were about what is the best approach here, and all right, if we have to do this, how do we do it the right way for Newbury? And so there was a bunch of factors that were considered when picking what might be an appropriate district. A couple of them listed up here. Really the big things being, are we near some efficient transportation options, whether that's the highway or the commuter rail station in Newburyport or other options? Are there opportunities for, if there is a redevelopment in the future, gateway improvement opportunities, we like to call it, when you're coming into town, if there's anything that gets developed there in the future, how do we make sure that's a nice looking development for the entrance into town? Access to any town amenities or public services are pretty key for housing, so if someone has easy access to public services or things like parks and schools, if there's potential for future development on the site, and what that potential might look like. And then addressing Newbury's housing needs, as we mentioned earlier, what are the needs in town, and is there a way to use this? If we're gonna have to do it, is there a way to use it to get at any gaps we see right now in the housing in town? This is a graphic that we like to show, which is called missing middle housing. And so this shows that chunk of housing structures that this law is kind of aimed at trying to produce more of. On the far left here, we have detached single-family homes. That's a lot of what we have in Newbury and across the Merrimack Valley. On the far right here, we have mid to high-rise apartment buildings. So those are what you see inside the 128 belt closer to Boston, really popping up everywhere. It's these chunk of housing types in the middle that were a lot of what we were focusing on as we were having this discussion. So everything from kind of a triplex all the way up to some more townhome or townhouse style apartments or condos, and thinking about how can we build at this scale instead of getting the large developments that we see most often of all the way out here. We see a lot produced single family and a lot produced large, so what we've been trying to say is how can we get in the middle of smaller units that folks might need. I have 2 slides of data to give you some insight as to how we were addressing that missing middle and what we saw as potential needs for Newbury. So I've been mentioning all along, we've seen a lack of smaller units in town. And so what these two charts are showing us is that we have a large chunk of housing units occupied by 1 or 2 person households. So 1 or 2 people are living in about 60% of Newbury's homes. So 1 or 2 people are living in those household structures. But the actual bedrooms, the bedroom sizes in your units, make up about 28% for studio, 1 bedroom, and 2 bedroom. So you have 60% of the homes are filled by 1 and 2 people, 28% of the homes are 1 or 2 bedroom homes. Now we know there's not gonna be a perfect match because some people want an extra bedroom for kids or wanna stay in their larger home for when their kids and grandkids visit. But when we see these numbers, 60% being smaller households, but then 28% only being the actual smaller structures, we know that that 60% that might, any chunk of that wants to downsize, they're competing for very few units in town. So those are some of those mismatches that we look at. Newbury's not alone in this, we see this across the Merrimack Valley, but that's the perspective as we're thinking about what are the needs in Newbury and how can we potentially address those. Demographic trends we also consider, so this looks at the different age cohorts in town and over the next 20, 30, 40 years, what are the projections for what Newbury's population is gonna look like? The big takeaway here, this blue line is the 65 plus population. So way back in Census 2010, it was under 15% of the population, but the projection by 2040 is that 35% of the population will be 65 plus. And so we see that aging population increasing over time, and so trying to think about what are the housing needs for folks aging, whether they're staying in place or staying in community, how do we ensure those options are there? And then finally, the last thing we consider is school enrollment. So what is school enrollment looking like in town, and what are the school-age children in the community compared to the region and here in Newbury? So as you can see, from 2002 all the way to 2020, we've actually seen about a 40% decrease in school enrollment over that time period. And so we've seen less and less school children in town, less and less young families. And so thinking about, going back to that slide about the age projections where you also see those younger age cohorts going down and you see the school enrollment going down, how do we make sure that we have more of a level environment of population mixes in town and that we see a more cohesive mix across the community? A lot of things can point to housing and a lot of things can be addressed through housing, and so one of those things we consider is your age, your bedroom mixes right now that we talked about at first, and then those school enrollments, and how do we make sure that we have the next generation of Newbury residents moving in. And so now we'll get into the chunk of what exactly is the proposal and going back to those restrictions that we're talking about. So there's 4 proposed sub-districts on the warrant next week. Those 4 are split up between what we call Newbury North and Newbury South, and we'll show the map in a minute and we'll show very close-up images as well. Newbury North has an A and B sub-district, Newbury South has an A and B sub-district. Those are important because the A's, the North A and the South A, have the same what we call dimensional parameters, the same height restrictions, the same setback requirements, and the B's have the same dimensional standards as well. The point of doing that was to ensure that in some areas we were encouraging less density, so more spread out homes and less intense development, And then in other areas, we were allowing for a bit more of that density to meet our requirements per state regulations. So as you'll see on the map soon, the A's we broke down as areas that might be better for the density that is what the state is requiring. And then the B's are the lesser density and making sure that they fit the community neighborhood feel. And we'll talk about what those look like in just a minute here with these slides. I'm gonna zoom in because you can't see it as much on a town-wide scale, but just so you can get an idea, way up here, this is the Newburyport Rotary and the commuter rail station. And up here, we got Hanover Street and Route 1 going up and down right here on the map. So these are the north districts, this chunk. You got Newbury Elementary School right here, zoomed in over here, and we're gonna zoom in even further soon. And then south districts, right where we are right now, you have Kent Way and the mall that we're in currently with town offices. And then you have another district along Central Street in the south here, and that's zoomed in here. You can see right along 95, Central Street, fire station over here. And we'll zoom in even closer. So a satellite view to give you a little bit of a better picture. So again, this is north A and B. You have Route 1, Middle Road here, Newbury Elementary here, and then Newbury South over here, the South Districts, you have where we are right now on Kent Way, and then B is the fire stations over here and Central Street runs over here. So when we say we've split up these dimensional standards, this is what we're talking about and what the requirements and restrictions are in place depending on the district that a developer may, be developing in. So sub-districts, the two A's, the key pieces to take away here, the max building height is 3 stories in the two A districts. Again, those A districts are the one right along Route 1 and the one where we are right now. The setbacks in the A district are 50 feet in the front yard and 25 feet in the rear and side yards. The max building coverage is 50%, so you can't build more than 50% of the lot with a building footprint. You are required to have 40% open space if you develop on that property, and then the parking average, you have to have an average of about 1.5 spaces per unit. That's broken down in the bylaw by actually saying if you have a studio or 1 bedroom apartment, you have to have 1 space, and if you have a 2 bedroom or more or larger units, you have to have 2 spaces for those units. The Bs we talked about have a little bit of a less density to them, and so we put some more restrictions on them. Number 1, the building height instead of 3 stories is 2.5 stories. The setbacks there are 50 feet in the front yard, and the big difference is the side and rear yards are 60 feet. And that is because, as you'll see in the picture shortly, that's because we wanted to make sure there was larger setbacks to the neighborhood that those B districts are around. So we increased the setbacks to 60 feet there. Maximum building coverage and minimum open space. The open space here is 50% as opposed to 40% in the A's, and the parking is the same. And we're going to talk about them in more detail with each slide here.
And where are they located? I should know, but I don't. The Bs.
Yep, so the B is the one right next to Newbury Elementary here on the north side. And then the other B is right along Central Street over here. The fire station's right here.
Okay.
To get your bearings in, 95 is that car symbol there.
Where the chickens run in the street.
Yeah.
Yes, that's how everyone knows it.
So you have Newbury North, this is sub-district A, this is that larger density parcel, and so close to the Newburyport commuter rail station, a couple of the reasons why we liked it, along the major road, Route 1, so you can easily get to and from places via car if you're not going to the commuter rail station. There are some smaller parcels on there, so it allows for what we call gentle density, which essentially means if it's a smaller parcel, they can't build a giant building on that small parcel, they're gonna be limited just by the size of the boundary. And an opportunity, if there is redevelopment on these sites, folks driving in from Newburyport, if there is a redevelopment there, it might be a good look if, as they're following the standards we put forward and some of those design elements, opportunity to improve any gateway looks coming into town. One of the things we're going to talk about with each slide is what we call the estimated unit capacity. And so this is a really wonky term, and we want to explain it to you all so you kind of have an understanding going into town meeting. What the state has required us to do is plug into their model, which is essentially a large Excel spreadsheet. We plug in the zoning, and it spits out to us, okay, under those zoning parameters, you have a 3-story height limit, and you're requiring half the parcel to be open space. This is how much we think maybe a developer could build on that site. And it really is an analysis based off of perfect site conditions, as I was talking about at the beginning. And so it's saying, all right, if you had a perfect site, if you had your sewer and water hookup ready to go, and if there wasn't any issues with maybe the sensitive environmental nature of the land, we think that size lot could fit this many units under a perfect scenario. And so as we go through each district, we're gonna talk about what that model spit out. The reason why we're talking about it now is because we wanna emphasize this is really a theoretical, what we call zoning analysis, not at all necessarily a build-out analysis. So the key example of what I mentioned earlier being, for example, sewer. We know a development coming in is gonna have to have a septic system of some sort on site. That's gonna eat up a lot of land that they are building on, and so that's naturally gonna restrict how many bedrooms they can put in there. There's also the state regulations that require you to have a certain size septic system for a certain size development, and so that naturally limits how many bedrooms you can actually put on site. This number at the bottom does not take any of that into consideration, and that's on purpose, and that is okay. And so that's kind of how we work through the numbers as we talk about it.
So the numbers we see are maximum numbers
Correct.
going forward, okay?
Yeah. Sub-district B, we're just zoomed in again, just so everybody can see it a bit closer up. So this is 3 parcels here. I'm not gonna go through all the descriptions of them on the side because they're pretty similar for why, as we went through discussions, they were eventually chosen. But it's right next to Newberry Elementary School. This is that lesser density size parcel, and so it's the ones that we're making sure that it'd be more spread out if there was development there. This again would have 60-foot setbacks all around the side, so if there are any neighbors, especially up here or closer to the elementary school, you have to be set back at least 60 feet for any development there. And that open space is required to be 50%. Yes?
Now, the land, all these parcels that you have marked off in pink,
Yeah,
that's probably private land, correct?
correct.
And it could be owned by like 20 different people. I mean, it's not like it's one
Sure.
owner and
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
saying, okay, we're putting up 40
Yep.
buildings or something like
Yeah.
that, is that correct?
Exactly.
So this that we're voting on it is just for the, what's the word?
Zoning.
Zoning.
The zoning, so it may be zoned, but it may never be developed.
Correct.
Correct.
And so,
And that's okay with the state?
yes, that's all the state is requiring is the zoning. So what still has to happen is if a property wants to sell, they have to sell. They also have to sell if there's a developer out there who wants to build it, then the developer has to buy it. Maybe they just sell to another person that wants.
If the developer wants to develop it, the owners must sell to them?
No.
Oh,
I'm saying the process that has to happen if a development were to come in. Apologies, yes.
You need to have
So-
a willing buyer and a willing
Yeah, you have to have a
Okay.
willing buyer and a willing seller in order for the perfect conditions to come forward for them to develop. And in that case, maybe someone's selling their home on one of these parcels. It might be another family that buys it, moves in, owns it for another 30 years and nothing happens. And so to that point, all we're doing is
So
zoning.
for them to wanna build something on that massive parcel right there, they may have to get 20 people to agree to sell their land.
Yeah,
correct?
if it's, depending on, there's 3
Whoever lives
parcels
there.
here and they would have to own it. Yeah,
Okay.
you have to own it.
How many people actually do own that property?
This is 3 lots split up here. They're several acres each, so this is 3 lots. The previous one was about 6 lots, 5 lots there. So it varies, and then we'll look at the other ones in the south soon.
So currently that lot has a single family, right? The one that's right on Hanover Street?
Yep.
Currently there's just
There's
one
one
house
owner?
there. It could stay, if this overlay zoning passes, it could stay one house forever. It could get rebuilt as one house. It could potentially get rebuilt as single-family homes, or the owner or a future owner could use the overlay zoning to do a multifamily development
So it
with
could go
those
3 or 4 different
parameters.
ways. If
Yeah.
those people wanna sell their land,
Yeah.
they could sell it for a
It's
single
more,
family.
more options,
Yeah.
exactly.
And we should have mentioned that up front, and I think the overlay district itself, so we're talking about an overlay zoning district, all the underlying zoning, like Kristen was mentioning, that allows single-family homes, that's still in effect, and so it just gives another option on top of that, essentially. Yeah,
Well, let me see if I understand this correctly. So currently, am I right, Newbury has, does not, it's only one dwelling on a lot. Is the only
in most
zoning that's
cases,
allowed.
I think there's some
With some very
areas.
narrow exceptions.
Very narrow exceptions, I think is fair.
By right, in most areas, we allow single family and 2-family. The 2-family depends on lot size, and that's dependent on water. We allow multifamily only in 2 districts, and that's only up to 4 units. But
okay.
most of the town is single
Single
family,
family.
2-family.
And so am I right about this? So that means when a developer comes, in order to kind of recoup their money, that kind of pushes them to build these mansions that a lot of people are pretty unhappy to
Right.
see, in order to recoup their money, which of course then moves the town to wealthier and wealthier and more exclusive, and ups the, decreases the options even more for moderate housing.
Right.
But this would let a developer, gee, if they wanted to have a little 3 townhouse type of unit, that's generally more affordable than a McMansion.
Mhm.
It gives them that ability to propose.
Right, so right now, a developer would have to build a single-family home. And we know that if they're only building a one home, they have to make back their investment on that one home, so they usually make a McMansion and they charge it, I say McMansion, but a larger home, and they price it above $1 million. And so if we're giving them another option, the goal here is to make sure they have that option, so if they build smaller units, those will be cheaper than the $1.5 million home if they can only build one home. Yeah.
Or, am I correct about this? Or they have that option to pull out a 40B, and now they skip all those rules, and the town has no say on what to do, or how it should be, or how it should look.
Right, and so the 40B is always an option for developers. They usually look for the path of least resistance, so to speak, and so they could do that at any point in time, but what we're trying to do is give them a path that's smoother for them to build multifamily so they don't go to the 40B. Yeah, go ahead.
So the property that's across the street from Pearson's Plaza.
Mm-hmm.
Now
We'll get to that
that's
next.
on the map there. Now
Yep.
that's already sold.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay.
So is that gonna be one, has the person, the developer who bought that land, is he one that wants to put in?
I don't know what their plans are currently or if it's been sold. Have they proposed anything with the town yet?
Nothing definite.
Because they said they have a year that they have to be out of there.
Yeah, so I'm sure they're looking at it, and if there's a new owner there, I'm sure they're gonna consider this zoning and the zoning that exists. I mean, any developer would. And so if there's a new owner that owns that, they're probably gonna look at it and see would they prefer this overlay district over the existing zoning, yeah. I'll just show this one and then the next one again. So again, we're over here at Kent Way, this is where we are sitting right now. This is that higher density, this is the A, so this is South A, so it allows 3-story height limits again, and it has less open space required and smaller setbacks from the side yard. One of the things that we looked at with this one, with potential for it, a couple things. Number one, walkable to services in Byfield Center. And number two, looking at the site right now, although it's not listed here, one of the things we were considering was that the site as it exists today, it's a lot of parking lot and a lot of what we call impervious surface, so all water runoff runs right off the site. If there's a redevelopment, we can put controls in there to make sure any new development is actually better for the environment and better for the abutting wetlands, because we're then gonna make sure there's less impervious surface, and so there's not as much water running off that has not been treated before it gets somewhere. So thinking about if this site were to redevelop, what is the potential there to make sure it's more environmentally friendly than exists today. And then the last district that we'll talk about here, Sub-District B, this is the one we just mentioned, down in Central Street, just across the highway from us, the fire station's over here, Pearson Plaza's up here. This is again that lower density, it is only allowed a maximum building height of 2.5 stories, and you have to have 50% open space on that parcel itself. I'm gonna go, any questions about those districts before we talk about the affordability requirement and the design guidelines that we've been alluding to this whole time? Yeah,
How did you come up with the previous picture, the one on Kent Way?
yeah.
Now you get 174 units there, is that because it's right next to the highway?
It's just based off of the size of the the lot itself, really, and saying that if
That includes this building, no?
it's if someone bought it and tore down the building and redeveloped the
Alright.
site,
So
yeah.
you've got that included in there, even
Yes.
though that's here, okay.
Yes,
alright,
yeah.
okay.
That's again, those ideal conditions where if there was nothing here and it was an empty
Alright,
field.
so if it was just
yeah,
land, it was
Yep.
174,
Yep.
that makes more sense.
Exactly.
And again,
Great
that's based
question.
on the compliance tool that Ian was talking about before, which, you plug certain parameters in and that's what comes out, but it's.
We're gonna talk a bit about the,
Do you have a hunch, or I mean, it's probably unfair to ask a planner about a hunch. Do you have a hunch how much of that would actually be buildable?
I could give an example, we don't have an exact number, but for example, we were talking about this in Rowley, we're helping them with MBTA communities as well. And they had a parcel that was modeling, so to speak, at, I think it was 500 or 600 units, it was a very large parcel, many, many acres. And there was a developer that had recently bought it actually, and they showed up at one of the meetings and they said, with those zoning parameters, I'm thinking 150 units. That is a significant difference from 600 of what is modeled there. And so that was a really interesting insight from the developer. They were like, well, you're limiting me to 3 stories and I can only build, I have to leave half of it empty. So that was interesting to hear. We don't have an exact analysis for Newbury though, yeah.
I would say though, the current use is like all the storage, right? It's like a business, they're just here during the day, it's storage units, and then it's office space where workers are here and then they go home. So septic on this parcel is, I think, probably a complete unknown. Like if it were to be redeveloped as housing, it would require a whole different assessment for what kind of septic, and that's, as all of us who live in Newbury know, that's one of the primary, assessments of feasibility that anyone looking to build needs to look at. Whether you're building a single home or a multifamily, you have to look at what, those are regulations that cannot be avoided when you don't have sewer.
Now, other than this building and their big parking lot and everything, is there open land included in that we don't know about? Because you can't see anything from the road.
Did we lose the
Yeah, I'm just
connection?
getting it back up. I have Go ahead, keep going.
The lot lines, as that aerial showed, are pretty much the edge of pavement.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
So this
there's
is
not a lot of extra land. I mean, the river, the Parker River,
Exactly, goes, and there's a
and then
stream
the
that goes right
highway,
behind
it's
it.
like kind
Yeah.
of,
It's blocked off.
yeah, there's not a lot of extra land besides what you see, so.
Doesn't look like Newbury.
Was it my background?
That doesn't look like Newbury.
Close, that'd be nice. I was trying to fix, I think my slides hadn't updated. I had a newer version in the next couple slides and I think something went wrong with the connection. But the next thing we just wanted to mention, it's just 2 more slides about the other key components of the bylaw. One being affordability and how we're requiring affordability, and design guidelines, those things that can say what type of building we want to see. So the first thing that we talk about is affordability. I'm going to skip over the actual slide I have written because it's outdated information that I can see. But we're requiring in the development 10% of all future units be designated as affordable. Now, what do we mean when we say affordable? An affordable unit is set at what is called 80% of the area median income. So when a unit is designated as affordable, it means a family only making just below the median income for the region can afford it. And so in Newbury, 100% of the area median income is about $100,000. That's roughly the median income for this area for a household. So any family that is at $80,000 qualifies for that affordable unit in that situation. So that's why we say middle income versus low income. The reason why it's structured that way is because the state is actually only allowing us to do that much affordability in these bylaws. There are a bunch of issues with economic feasibility, we call it. When you build affordable housing, it's very expensive to build affordable housing, and it's very hard for developers to get a return on their profit when they build affordable housing. So in order to make development feasible, the state is only allowing us to require 10% of the units be set aside for those middle income households. So as a part of this bylaw as proposed at town meeting next week, any future development, 10% of the units in it would have to be affordable. So if they build 10 units, there needs to be 1 affordable unit. If they build 20, there needs to be 2 affordable units in it. That's the maximum we could do, and so we decided to do that in Newbury's case. Right now, elsewhere in Newbury, there aren't affordability requirements, so this would be development that actually requires affordability, which is a step forward for Newbury in helping to make sure there's more middle income options. The last thing that we do want to mention is what we call design guidelines, and so there are some different guidelines written in the bylaw itself that a developer has to adhere to when they come to the planning board. And so when they have the development proposed, if they check all the other boxes, like they're under 3 stories in some of those districts, they have the 50% open space, they then have to show that they are adhering to the type of development that Newbury wants to see. So they show the actual design of their building and how it aligns with the type of design that we've seen in Newbury historically and in surrounding communities. So some key elements that we mention are things like pitched roofs instead of flat roofs. So nobody likes to see a flat roof, so let's make sure that it's pitched like most of our houses are. If it's a larger building, make sure there's varying roof lines, we call it, so it's not just one big block that you're looking at or one big structure that you're staring at. Variations in the facade of the building, so not just one large just swath of the same plane on the front of the building, but making sure there's things like bump outs and bay windows and overhangs above the doors, that sort of thing. And a couple of the other key things like environmental sustainability, we want to see certain different landscaping and stormwater runoff mitigation. So that way if there's rainfall, it goes into the ground uncontaminated, several other pieces to that. And certain connections for both pedestrians and other types of transportation to the surrounding neighborhoods. So make sure they have sidewalks entering and exiting their development. And then one of the key things, in addition to those setbacks that we're requiring, is we also want to see developers make sure there's some type of buffer between the edge of their buildings and then the neighboring properties. So in some of those lots that we were looking at, they are neighboring some single-family homes. So we have in there some type of trees or landscape buffer in addition to setback 60 feet. We also want to see trees, bushes, etc., so that it is not intruding on neighboring properties.
Are those requirements or suggestions?
Those are requirements in the bylaw.
On any of our landscaping requirements or buffers, is there anything in there that addresses using native species?
Yes,
Thank
Great
you
question, yeah.
very
yeah,
much.
that's one of the requirements.
Thank you very much.
The town staff was on top of that when we were writing it. They
Huge.
said, yeah, drought tolerant species, that sort of thing, yeah.
Yeah, and water catch.
Count against the,
And energy efficiency.
No, so if there's like a bay window maybe that bumps out from the facade, no, you look at the building footprint when you consider this, no, and
don't
it's
know.
generally not more than,
You don't?
a couple feet anyway, yeah. We're gonna have time for questions, even though this is the last slide. The next steps, really, you all are gonna be voting, next week at town meeting. So you have the opportunity to be voting in favor or against this proposed bylaw. Like we said, Newbury has until 2025 to comply with the law. So depending on the results of town meeting next week, we'll either be moving forward with a full compliance application with the state and asking them to say yes, or if residents vote it down, we have to go back to the drawing board and try and put something together pretty quickly to make sure that the town is in compliance with the law by the end of their deadline. I just spoke to you all for an hour. So thank you for your patience in listening and learning. Are there any other questions that we didn't cover that folks need to know about before next week that they'd like to ask? Yeah.
Do we need to adopt all 4 parcels in order to comply with what the state is requiring?
Good question. There are different configurations within the proposal right now. There could be less and you'd still be compliant. So there could be less land and you'd still be in compliant with the state law.
Is it 154 units for the whole, all parcels together?
Yes.
So they could put them all in one spot and that would cover it?
Yes, as long as it adheres to also the density requirements.
Yes.
And so some of those districts we talked about, they don't have the density requirement needed for the state. And so it has to adhere to that as well. This was a holistic approach to not only where do we meet those bare minimum requirements, but where can we make sure that the type of development we want to see happens. Yeah.
So is it the A districts that are the ones that meet the density requirement and the B are
Less density.
less density?
Together, combined, those two, yeah.
But by waiting, if it's deferred, that lot that's bought could be developed into a 40B in the meantime and end up with something
Yeah, if they don't have that option, they might decide to go to a 40B, yeah.
than the plan that we have that has all these setbacks and height limits and
Yeah.
open space requirement,
Yeah.
So it's a bit, kind of a gamble.
Yeah.
Also, we actually need housing. I mean, personally, to me, that kind of gets left out of the conversation a
Yeah.
lot.
How much of this is gonna be presented at town meeting?
An abridged version.
And it won't be an hour-long presentation, but there will be some.
You all are the lucky ones. I think you're gonna get to hear me again next week. But a shorter version and try to get more information up front. I don't wanna hold folks past the time. 1 or 2 more questions before we end? Yeah.
This is just a suggestion, I know it's not in this plan.
Yeah.
But, you know, when you showed the aging population.
Yeah.
Of which I'm one, thank you. Those people who live in the 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms and are looking for something smaller, but they can't afford something.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if that's something that could be written in, that first dibs
Yeah.
go to a Byfield resident, then they can sell their 4 bedroom to a family,
Yeah.
and they could still live in town.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are some state laws that prevent a certain amount of what we call local option.
Yeah.
And so you can't restrict all the units to be just for residents in that town, and that's statewide. But it's certainly, there are some tools to encourage that, yeah.
And there's nothing to prohibit a developer if he wanted to come in with, you know, an over 55 or something
Right,
that
for
could be
fuel.
done under the
Yeah,
bylaw.
they
We
can
just
still do
can't
an over
require it.
55 development, we just can't require them to do an over 55 development. Well, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. We'll still be here for a few minutes after. Kristen, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I think Martha and I can stay till 8, so, thank you so much, Ian. I just wanna get your input since you're here. What do you think would be helpful at town meeting? The flyer that's yellow in your hand, the one pager, or a copy of all the slides that we're gonna present that has, you know, like a PowerPoint, like, but it would be sort of a bunch of pages. Like, we're just trying to think about
Are you doing a
how to do
presentation?
a short presentation.
Like this?
Yes, but obviously there's a lot of content, so we also wanna
I
provide.
can't
an
imagine
agenda.
anybody sitting there reading it at town meeting.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
I wouldn't, too much.
This
Yeah,
one-
maybe that,
This one would be.
just
The
that
one
page,
pager,
yeah.
yeah, okay, that's what we're leaning towards, I just kinda wanted to get a sense of, because it is a very complicated, complex topic with a lot of.
Get a hand in the back, Kristen.
I think one of the important things that would be useful to point out is the distinction between the maximum, where you get some pretty mind-blowing numbers
Yeah.
of units, versus what actually can happen, because people, if they don't understand that, they're gonna be like, no way, I would,
Yeah.
it's way too many
Yeah.
units.
Yeah, certainly, good point, yeah.
Are any of the areas in flood zones currently?
I'd have to look at the map. If they are in flood zones, they still have to adhere to the regulation that would apply to a flood zone. Go ahead.
I don't think this one was.
Yeah, don't know. Flood zones in those?
Yeah, no.
There's wetlands on the property, and here we have, you know, we're abutting the river, so there's riverfront protection area, but I don't think there's any, you know, we stayed away from Plum Island.
Personally, I like having the slide presentation available, and it's really for the aftermath. So that, you know, we have that documentation in front of us,
Yeah,
so that we can deal with the other varying opinions that will come out.
yeah, yeah,
Great.
okay, well.
Well, like we said, we'll hang around if people have follow-up questions. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Hope many of you are able to make it to town meeting next week, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.